The CEO thought betrayal would come from hackers outside his walls. He never imagined the trap was set by the people he trusted most, until the janitor stepped into his path. The glass doors of the Crosstech Tower slid open with their usual quiet precision, and Ethan Cross stepped inside, his shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. He had built this skyscraper from years of code, contracts, and sleepless nights, and every detail of the lobby reflected his sense of control: the gleaming steel beams, the quiet hum of hidden security, the sleek reception desk, where employees rose from their seats as he passed. At 34, Ethan was already worth hundreds of millions, his cybersecurity empire guarding the secrets of governments and corporations alike, and he carried himself with the calm authority of someone used to being the most prepared man in the room. He expected nothing unusual on this Monday morning, just another day of meetings and numbers and negotiations, but then Miguel moved. Miguel was the janitor, an older man with tired eyes, and a posture bent from years of cleaning floors that shone brighter than most people's futures. Ethan had seen him countless times, mopping quietly at dawn or polishing glass late at night, but never really noticed him. That morning, Miguel stepped away from his cart and directly into Ethan's path. His hand rose slightly, not to stop him but to slow him, his voice low and urgent. Words meant only for Ethan's ears. "Don't take the first call." Ethan blinked, surprised not by the words, but by the fact Miguel had spoken at all. He searched the man's face, saw the lines carved deep from long hours, the eyes sharp beneath the weariness. Miguel did not look like someone telling a joke. He looked like someone carrying a burden. Ethan opened his mouth to ask what he meant, but the vibration of his phone interrupted. He pulled it from his pocket, the screen lighting with the name of his CFO, a man he trusted like a brother. First call. The phone buzzed again, insistent, as if daring him to ignore it. Miguel's eyes flicked to the device, then back to Ethan's. A silent plea layered inside that single warning. Ethan's instinct was to answer, to do what he always did, to move quickly, to stay ahead of everything. But something in Miguel's stare held him. Against all logic, against habit, Ethan let the phone ring until it fell silent. His chest felt tight, his mind already turning over possibilities. Why would Miguel stop him? Why would he say those words? The phone chimed again with a voicemail notification, and Ethan's thumb hovered, but he didn't press play. Instead, he looked back at Miguel, who had already stepped aside, returning to his cart as though nothing had happened. He pushed the mop bucket forward, his body bending back into invisibility, but Ethan knew he could not let it go. The warning had been clear, the timing exact, the weight undeniable. Something was waiting for him inside that call, something dangerous enough for a man who lived in the background to finally step forward. Ethan walked toward the elevator, but his world no longer felt steady. The marble gleam looked sharper, the quiet lobby louder, and one question burned louder than all the others. What would have happened if he had answered? Ethan stood still in the center of the lobby as the second call lit up his phone. The name of his CFO glowing across the glass, like a command he could not ignore. For years he had trusted this man with more than money. He had trusted him with his vision, his secrets, his company's lifeblood, and yet now, the memory of Miguel's whispered warning pressed against him with strange weight. "Don't take the first call," the janitor had said, and Ethan felt the words circle in his head like an echo he could not silence. His hand tightened around the phone, his thumb hovering over the green icon, the pull of habit stronger than reason, but for the second time in minutes he resisted, letting it ring out until the silence returned, heavier than before. The receptionist glanced up at him with polite confusion, perhaps surprised he had not answered, but no one else seemed to notice the strange stillness that filled him. The lobby continued its rhythm, employees passing through the turnstiles with coffee cups and laptop bags, the security guards watching with professional indifference, the city beyond the glass humming with the rush of traffic. Yet Ethan felt as if he were standing on the edge of something unseen, a line drawn between the predictable life he knew and something darker waiting beyond. The voicemail alert blinked at him, demanding attention. And he hesitated again, unwilling to play it, unwilling to know what words had been left in his absence. His mind drifted back to Miguel, already vanished into the background, pushing his cart toward the far hall, head bent as if he had never spoken at all. Ethan's instincts told him this was no casual remark, no superstition, no joke. The janitor had timed his warning to the very second the call arrived, and that meant he knew something. Ethan moved toward the elevators, his reflection stretched tall in the polished doors, and his thoughts churned. For years he had believed success meant eliminating uncertainty, designing systems so airtight that nothing could surprise him. Yet here he was, shaken by a few words from a man he had never truly seen before today. The phone buzzed again, not with a call but with a text, his CFO's name appearing once more, the message short, urgent, asking if Ethan had received his call, asking if he was alone. The phrasing felt wrong, almost rehearsed, and the unease inside him deepened. The elevator rose smoothly, carrying him to the executive floor, but each second stretched longer, his chest tight with the awareness that a choice had been made. By not answering that first call, he had stepped off the script, broken the pattern, and whatever would have happened had been delayed or redirected. He could feel the unseen consequences already shifting like gears hidden inside a clock, events rearranging themselves around his silence. When the doors opened to his floor, Ethan knew with sharp clarity that nothing about this week, this company, or this life would remain ordinary again. Ethan found Miguel again near the service corridor. The older man bent over a mop bucket as though nothing unusual had happened in the lobby, as though he had not just whispered something that kept the CEO of Crosstech from answering a call that could have altered his life. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the way Miguel's shoulders moved with slow rhythm, the way his head stayed down, the way he seemed to fold himself into invisibility. It struck Ethan that in all the years he had walked past this man, he had never once stopped to wonder what those eyes might have seen. He cleared his throat, the sound louder than he intended, and Miguel turned with practiced calm. "What did you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice low, "when you told me not to take the call?" Miguel's expression hardly shifted, only the smallest flicker of his eyes toward the floor, as though the words had never left his mouth. "Just trying to help, sir," he said quietly, dipping the mop into the water and wringing it out with creaking hands. Ethan stepped closer, unwilling to let the moment vanish. "That wasn't just help. You knew the call was coming. You knew I would be tempted to answer. Tell me why." Miguel's silence stretched, broken only by the squeak of the mop against tile. His face betrayed little, but Ethan had spent years learning to read boardrooms and courtrooms, and he saw it, the quick tension in the jaw, the way the eyes darted away too quickly. This man was hiding something, not out of malice but out of caution. Ethan felt the edge of frustration, but forced himself to stay calm. "You've worked here longer than anyone. You see everything, don't you?" Miguel paused, leaning on the handle as though gathering strength. "People don't notice the ones who clean up after them," he said finally. "But when you're invisible, you see things others forget to hide." The words struck Ethan like a key turning in a lock. He thought of nights when he stayed late, head bent over code, and realized Miguel had always been somewhere nearby, unnoticed. He thought of whispered conversations in hallways, contracts carried in sealed envelopes, the private glances exchanged between executives. If Miguel had been paying attention all these years, then he held a map of patterns no one else could claim. "What have you seen?" Ethan pressed. Miguel shook his head. "Too much, maybe. Things not meant for me to repeat." His tone was final, but his eyes betrayed knowledge, sharp and knowing, filled with fragments of secrets. Ethan felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold floors. He realized that this man, overlooked and underestimated, carried inside him a record of the company's true life, its hidden undercurrents, its dangers wrapped in whispers. Ethan stood back, studying Miguel with new respect and unease. Whatever was unfolding, the janitor was part of it, whether he admitted it or not. And Ethan understood. He could no longer afford to ignore him. Ethan sat in his office with the skyline pressing against the windows, the morning sun scattering silver light across the glass desk, his phone lying in front of him like a question he did not want to answer. The missed calls from his CFO still glowed on the screen, patient reminders that business would not wait for whispers in lobbies or strange warnings from janitors. He pressed play on the voicemail, telling himself it was nothing more than routine, yet the moment the voice began, he felt his pulse quicken. The tone was urgent, practiced, the words tumbling too fast as if rehearsed. His CFO spoke of a problem with the acquisition, something about documents that needed Ethan's immediate approval, a delay that could cost millions if not resolved before noon. Ethan had heard this man speak hundreds of times, in meetings, over dinners, during negotiations, and he knew his rhythms well. But this was different, the cadence broken by hesitation that felt unnatural. He leaned closer, playing the message again, this time focusing on the spaces between words, the faint breaths, the pauses that should not have been there. Then he caught it, soft but undeniable, another voice beneath the first, a whisper feeding lines, prompting phrases, guiding the call. It was faint, but it was there, a pattern of murmurs that matched the stumbles of his CFO, as if someone else were scripting the conversation in real time. Ethan's chest tightened, his mind racing through possibilities. Why would his CFO, the man he trusted most in the company, need someone else to dictate a voicemail, especially one meant for Ethan alone? He played it a third time, turning up the volume, isolating the faintest sounds. The second voice was not clear enough to identify, but the presence itself was enough to chill him. It meant his CFO was not alone when he made the call. It meant the message was not private. It meant someone else knew the inner workings of a deal that should have been sealed within the walls of the executive floor. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the device as if it might confess something more, but it only glowed in silence, indifferent to the weight of its revelations. The acquisition had been the cornerstone of Crosstech's growth strategy, a move that would secure their dominance in encrypted communications, and every detail had been guarded with layers of security. If someone outside the company had access to even fragments of that plan, the consequences could be devastating. Ethan remembered Miguel's warning, the insistence not to take the first call, and he understood now that the janitor's words had saved him from stepping directly into a trap he still could not see. His phone buzzed again, another call from the same number, and this time Ethan did not answer either. He sat in the stillness of his office, the hum of the servers in the next room filling the air, the weight of suspicion pressing down harder with every second. He knew one thing with certainty: someone was writing a script, and his CFO was no longer speaking with his own voice. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the voicemail still echoing in his mind, the whispered second voice like a shadow he could not shake. He tried to push it aside, to focus on the numbers glowing across his screen, but instead his thoughts slid backward, unspooling moments he had ignored, details he had explained away. There had been contracts that arrived already bearing signatures from people who had not yet attended the meetings, documents that should have been blank, waiting for his approval, yet somehow already stamped with authority. He had told himself it was efficiency, his staff working ahead of schedule, but now the memory left a sour taste, the certainty that someone had been moving pieces without his knowledge. He thought of the board members, men and women who usually looked to him for direction, who in recent weeks had begun asking sharp questions about strategies he had not shared, about timelines he had not announced. One had leaned across the polished table and asked if he was sure the encryption upgrade would be ready by October, though Ethan had only discussed that deadline in private with his CFO. Another had pressed him about overseas interest, though those negotiations had been locked behind encrypted files no one outside his closest circle could access. At the time, he had brushed it off as guesswork or coincidence, but now he saw the pattern, the careful leaking of his own secrets into rooms where they did not belong. And then there was Danielle, his fiancée, with the easy laugh and the careful grace. The woman who had walked into his life at a conference 2 years ago and seemed to know exactly how to steady him when work pulled too hard. She had always shown interest in his company, enough to flatter him without stepping into his territory. But lately she had changed. She pressed him to finalize the merger with an impatience that felt strange, reminding him at dinner, nudging him in the morning, teasing him late at night that he was overthinking. She had even spoken to his CFO once without telling him, a conversation he only discovered when she mentioned details she could not have known otherwise. He had told himself she was just invested in his success, eager for their shared future. But now he felt the chill of doubt creep along his skin. The shadow of betrayal stretched across his mind, not yet formed into a clear figure, but heavy with possibility. Every piece connected, contracts touched before their time, questions asked before answers were public. The pressure to move faster than his instincts advised. Ethan rubbed his temples, the city humming beyond the glass walls of his office, the weight of his empire suddenly fragile. Trust, he realized, had been his greatest currency, and somewhere inside his circle that trust had already been sold. He thought again of Miguel's whisper in the lobby, the quiet warning that saved him, and he wondered if the janitor had seen the shadow long before he did. Ethan found Miguel in the sublevel corridor late that evening, the air heavy with the smell of bleach and the quiet hum of machines that never rested. The janitor was pushing his cart slowly, his steps deliberate, as though every corner of the building carried a memory only he could see. Ethan stepped into his path, his voice sharp with the tension of a man who could no longer afford half answers. Miguel stopped without surprise, his hands resting on the mop handle, his eyes calm yet shadowed with the weight of what he had kept inside. Ethan asked again what he had meant, why he had warned him not to take the first call, and this time Miguel did not turn away. "I have been here longer than most of your executives," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying the steady rhythm of truth. 20 years I have walked these halls, cleaning offices after meetings, emptying bins filled with secrets, polishing floors that hear more than they should. People forget I am here, but I see who stays late, who whispers when they think the walls do not listen, who moves papers from one desk to another when they think no one is watching. His words were simple, but they struck Ethan with the force of a revelation. Miguel's gaze held him, steady and without hesitation. "Your CFO, he is not alone in this. I have seen him meet with your fiancée when you are away. Not once, not twice, but many times. They talk in corners, they slip into conference rooms, they leave at different times but never far apart. I have seen him hand her folders, thin ones that fit under her coat. I have heard them whisper about timelines, about contracts, about you." The words landed heavy, colder than the marble floors beneath them. Ethan's throat tightened, though his mind wanted to deny it. Danielle's smile, her warmth, her encouragement, all replayed in fragments that suddenly felt rehearsed. He asked Miguel if he was certain, if he had not misunderstood, and Miguel only shook his head, his face lined with the kind of patience born from years of being ignored. "I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know when someone pretends to love while plotting something else. This building teaches you to see through masks." For a moment Ethan could only stand there, caught between disbelief and the sharp sting of recognition. He thought of the contracts signed before they should have been, of the board questions too precise to be accidents, of Danielle's urging to rush a merger that should have been carefully studied. Miguel had no reason to lie, no stake in company politics, only the quiet authority of a man who had watched longer than anyone realized. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of a light overhead. Miguel lowered his voice even further. "You build walls of code to keep enemies out, Mr. Cross. But sometimes the cracks are made by the people you trust most. I warned you because I do not want to see you destroyed by the ones closest to you." Ethan spent the next morning moving through his own building as if he were a stranger, his eyes sharpened by Miguel's words, The ordinary corridors now lined with clues he had never thought to question. For years he had believed his skyscraper to be airtight. Every camera positioned, every badge swipe recorded, every line of code guarding its secrets. But once Miguel had spoken, the illusions began to fall away. Passing the service elevators, Ethan noticed the trash bags waiting for disposal, thick black plastic tied in knots. He had never looked at them before, yet now he saw the labels faintly marked in pen, the kind used by assistants when clearing desks. One bag bore the initials of an executive who had been overseas all month, yet the shredded papers inside were fresh, edges still stiff, the ink not faded. Miguel's voice echoed in his mind. People move things when they think no one watches. He walked past the reception desk, nodding at the guard, his gaze drifting to the sign, in tablet where visitors' names scrolled in neat lines. He had trusted those logs for security audits, believing them clean. But today he saw the oddities. Names entered with minor misspellings, numbers that did not match company records, signatures too perfect, as if copied rather than written. He asked casually about one visitor listed the week before, a supposed consultant, and the receptionist frowned, admitting she had never seen him, that the entry had appeared already filled in when she returned from a break. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he realized how many doors might have opened under false identities. By the time he reached the boardroom, he was no longer seeing polished surfaces and controlled order, but the gaps, the stains left behind, the impressions that told a different story. A chair was pulled back farther than it should have been, as though someone had lingered to listen outside the circle of power. A glass bore fingerprints not cleared away, smudges that did not belong to any meeting he had scheduled. He remembered Miguel saying he knew who lingered after hours, and suddenly he could imagine them. Shadows bent over files, voices low against the hum of air conditioning, secrets slipping into pockets while the city slept. Ethan stood at the tall window overlooking the streets, his reflection staring back, and for the first time, he felt the fragility of everything he had built. He had assumed betrayal would come from outside, a rival firm, a hacker across the world. But now he understood the truth was quieter, buried in overlooked details that only someone invisible had taken the time to notice. Miguel's perspective was not paranoia, it was survival. The way a man learned to endure 2 decades of silence while surrounded by people who never thought to look at him. Ethan pressed his hand to the glass, his mind racing, and he admitted to himself that the empire was no longer safe. Not from strangers, not from enemies, but from within. The building was nearly empty when Ethan returned late that night, the echo of his footsteps bouncing off marble floors that usually hummed with voices and movement. The executive wing was dark, his office a quiet silhouette against the skyline, but down the service corridor, a faint light spilled from a half-open door. Curiosity pulled him forward, each step deliberate, and when he reached the threshold, he stopped, unseen. Inside, Miguel sat at a narrow table, his cart pushed aside, his head bent over a worn notebook whose pages curled at the edges. His pen moved slowly, carefully, filling lines with a patience that seemed older than the building itself. Ethan leaned closer, catching fragments on the page, columns of dates, neat rows of initials, small notes written in shorthand. Miguel's voice was soft, almost like a prayer, as he read over what he had written, muttering names and times, cross-checking patterns. Ethan realized with a jolt that this was no idle scribbling. This was a surveillance log, more detailed than anything his own security team had ever produced. Each page recorded moments no one else had noticed, executives who lingered long after they claimed to leave, shipments arriving at odd hours, visitors who appeared twice under different names, doors that opened when they should have stayed locked. The notebook stretched back months, maybe years, the ink fading on some entries, but the vigilance unbroken. Ethan stepped inside, and Miguel looked up without surprise, as though he had expected to be caught eventually. He closed the notebook halfway, his hand resting on the cover, but Ethan had already seen enough to understand. "Why?" Ethan asked quietly. "Would you keep all this?" Miguel's expression was steady, his voice calm. "Because patterns matter. People show you who they are when they think you are invisible. I may mop their floors, but I see which doors they open, which papers they carry, who they meet when they believe no one is watching." The words struck Ethan harder than he expected. He had spent his life building systems to track, to monitor, to protect data. Yet this man, with his worn shoes and tired hands, had been protecting something more fragile: the truth inside the walls. Ethan pulled a chair and sat across from him, studying the notebook in silence. There were initials he recognized instantly, including his CFO, appearing too often at odd hours, sometimes paired with Danielle's name. There were arrows drawn between dates, lines connecting visits, a picture forming of collusion dressed as routine. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a mix of shame and respect. For months, maybe longer, Miguel had been watching, recording, building a map of betrayal, while Ethan walked past him each morning without a word. The empire he believed he alone defended had been guarded in silence by the one man no one saw. Looking at the notebook, Ethan realized Miguel had not only warned him, he had been protecting him all along, and the threat disguised within his own circle was now laid bare in ink. Ethan sat alone in his office, with Miguel's notebook open on the desk, the pages filled with neat rows of dates and initials that told a story more damning than any official report could. He traced his finger over the lines that showed his CFO meeting Danielle late at night, the entries marked with arrows and underlined notes, and he began to piece the fragments together. At first it had seemed like scattered coincidences: contracts arriving early, board members asking suspicious questions, visitors signing under false names. But now, the picture sharpened into something undeniable. Danielle and his CFO were not simply meeting in secret. They were plotting something precise, something dangerous. And all of it revolved around the one project Ethan had guarded above everything else: the new defense encryption algorithm. The algorithm was the crown jewel of Crosstech, a system capable of locking down military communications with a level of security no competitor could match. Governments waited for its release, investors whispered of billion-dollar valuations, and Ethan had worked sleepless nights perfecting the code. To lose control of it would mean more than financial ruin. It would mean betrayal of trust at the highest levels, and now he saw that betrayal unfolding within his own home and boardroom. The first call his CFO had made, the one Miguel had stopped him from answering, was no ordinary check-in. It had been a trap designed to pull him into confirming details that could be twisted into legality. A single word of agreement on that call, a careless affirmation, could have bound him to a transaction he never approved. He thought of Danielle leaning close to him at dinner, her hand brushing his wrist as she spoke softly of their future, urging him to finalize the merger she claimed would secure everything. He thought of his CFO's steady voice in meetings, the loyalty Ethan had never doubted, now revealed as rehearsed. They had been working together, feeding each other lines, preparing him to step willingly into the snare. The truth was simple and brutal: they intended to sell his algorithm to a rival firm, one that had been chasing Crosstech for years, but never managing to catch up. If the rival got hold of his design, they would not just surpass him, they would bury him, erasing his company's dominance in a single move. Ethan pushed back from the desk, the city lights burning outside the glass, his reflection staring back with eyes that felt older in a single night. He had built Crosstech on precision, on anticipating threats before they emerged. Yet the most dangerous threat had been beside him all along, hidden in the smile of the woman he planned to marry, and the handshake of the man he once called his closest ally. He closed Miguel's notebook slowly, the weight of it heavy in his hands, and he understood that the war for his company had already begun. The false merger was not just a business trick, it was a betrayal of trust, and he would not let it succeed. Ethan walked the halls of Crosstech with a new kind of awareness, every sound sharpened, every face studied, yet he carried the weight of uncertainty like a stone in his chest. Miguel's notebook sat locked in his desk drawer, its pages full of revelations that had shaken him to his core, but doubt crept in whenever the office grew too quiet. What if the janitor had his own motives? What if the warnings were part of another scheme? What if he was being manipulated into seeing betrayal where none existed? Ethan had built his life on evidence, on proof that could be traced and tested, and though the patterns Miguel recorded were convincing, Ethan knew better than to act without certainty. He resolved to follow the man's instincts, to watch as he watched, to gather before accusing. For days he carried himself as if nothing had changed, attending meetings, greeting Danielle with steady warmth, answering his CFO's questions with practiced calm. He let them believe he was distracted by deadlines, exhausted from long nights of coding, but inside his mind, he tracked their every move. He began checking visitor logs himself, memorizing times and names, cross-referencing them with the security feeds. Miguel's claims proved true. Certain faces appeared under different names, slips too subtle for casual eyes. Ethan noted which doors opened after hours, which employees stayed later than necessary, who lingered by elevators as if waiting for someone not listed on the schedule. At night he returned to the service corridors where Miguel worked, observing without speaking, studying the way the janitor cataloged movements, how he paused outside rooms and tilted his head as though listening to secrets the walls could not hold. Miguel never pressed him, never tried to prove more than he already had, only carried on with his quiet discipline. The absence of pressure made Ethan wonder if this was what trust looked like, someone offering what they knew and stepping back, expecting him to decide. One evening, Ethan arrived home early and found Danielle at his desk, a folder open beneath her hands. She smiled when he entered, explaining she was leaving him a note, but he noticed the faint indentation where she had traced her finger over the signature line of a contract not yet finalized. He said nothing, only kissed her cheek. Yet his resolve hardened. Later that night, he checked the building logs again, and there it was, another visit from his CFO, during hours when no meetings were scheduled, initials marked neatly on Miguel's page from the same time. The patterns grew undeniable, but Ethan still waited, gathering each detail with the patience he rarely allowed himself. He felt the slow burn of anger under his ribs, the betrayal pushing him toward confrontation, yet he knew too much was at stake. To accuse without proof would expose his hand and give them time to cover theirs. So he watched, he listened, and he learned, telling himself that when the moment came he would be ready. The hardest part was silence, but it was also the only path to truth. The office was quiet long after most of the staff had gone home, the city lights flickering through the tall glass panes, like distant signals. Ethan closed his laptop and looked across the desk at Miguel, the janitor standing patiently with his cart nearby. The mop set aside, his eyes steady. Ethan unlocked a drawer and pulled out a small handheld scanner he used during product tests, a device meant for hunting stray signals in network-heavy environments. Tonight it would serve another purpose. Miguel said nothing, only nodded once, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Together they began with the walls, the scanner humming softly as it swept across polished surfaces. The first sound came from the far corner, a faint beep where a landscape painting hung in a heavy frame. Ethan lifted it carefully and found a thin black microphone, no larger than a pen cap, its wire hidden behind the frame. His pulse spiked as he pulled it free, placing it on the desk with care. Miguel only gave a slow nod, as though confirmation of what he already knew. They moved on, Ethan crawling beneath the boardroom table where countless meetings had been held, the scanner buzzing louder against the underside. He peeled away a strip of wood to reveal a transmitter the size of a coin, adhesive still fresh. He pictured every strategy meeting, every investor call, every whispered disagreement, all captured and sent, who knew where. Miguel climbed a ladder toward the chandelier in the lobby, his movements practiced, while Ethan held the scanner aloft. The device wailed near the central fixture, and when Miguel reached inside the ornate glass, his hand closed around another transmitter. This one fitted with a small blinking light. He descended the ladder slowly, handing it over without a word. Ethan stared at it, his stomach twisting, the realization sinking in that his company, his fortress of code and contracts, had been turned into an open book. They continued their sweep, uncovering a device hidden inside a ventilation grate, another pressed beneath the arm of a leather chair, one more tucked behind the television in the lounge. Each discovery left Ethan colder, the pile on his desk growing into a silent accusation. He thought of every private conversation he had trusted to these walls, every idea, every plan, every personal moment shared in what he thought was safety. All of it had been captured, stolen, and possibly used against him already. When they finally stopped, the desk was scattered with microphones and transmitters, a collection that could have outfitted an entire surveillance operation. Miguel closed his notebook and looked at him with quiet gravity. Ethan pressed his palms flat against the desk, his reflection warped in the glossy surface, his mind turning with fury and clarity. Whoever planted these devices knew his company inside and out, knew where he worked, where he sat, where he breathed. The betrayal was no longer a shadow, but a fact written in wires and circuits. Trust had been shattered, and the enemy was already inside. Ethan stood at the window of his office the next morning. The skyline spread before him in cold gray light, his mind sharpened by the memory of the devices piled across his desk the night before. He had not slept, every hour replaying the sound of transmitters buzzing beneath trusted walls, every thought returning to the two people who had stood closest to him. His CFO had been by his side since the beginning, shaping the company's rise from late-night coffee-fueled sessions to billion-dollar contracts. Yet now, Ethan saw cracks in the loyalty he had taken for granted. When the man entered his office, carrying a folder tucked neatly beneath his arm, Ethan forced a calm smile, determined to test the truth without showing his hand. They spoke of numbers and projections, the CFO's voice steady and practiced, but Ethan listened differently now. Every phrase landed too smoothly, each answer polished as though rehearsed in advance, not the natural rhythm of conversation, but the measured delivery of someone sticking to a script. Ethan asked a question about the merger, one he had never voiced aloud, and the response came instantly, too quick, as if waiting for its cue. The chill inside Ethan grew. He leaned back in his chair, nodding as though satisfied, while his mind raced with the knowledge that Miguel's suspicions had been right. The conversation ended with a handshake that felt foreign, and as the CFO left the office, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Danielle. She was downstairs, she wrote, surprising him with coffee and a smile. His chest tightened as he read the words, the timing too perfect, the visit too sudden. Moments later, she swept into his office, her presence filling the room with practiced warmth, her arms circling his neck as if she had nothing to hide. She laughed about missing him, about wanting to see him in the middle of the day, yet Ethan caught the way her eyes flicked toward the desk, the way she noticed the folder his CFO had just left behind. Miguel's warnings echoed in Ethan's mind as he watched her move across the room, her fingers trailing over the edge of his chair, her charm a veil so carefully constructed. She asked about the acquisition, her tone playful but her questions precise, probing just enough to draw out details she should not have known. Ethan answered vaguely, keeping his words measured, and her smile never faltered, but the truth pressed down on him with unbearable weight. When she finally left, leaving behind the scent of perfume and the echo of her laughter, Ethan stood alone in the silence. His hands curled into fists as he stared at the door, the fracture of loyalty now clear and undeniable. Both his CFO and Danielle had played their parts perfectly, but he had seen past the polish, past the rehearsed lines, past the charm. Trust had been broken on both fronts, and Ethan knew the betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. The night pressed heavy against the glass walls of Ethan's office. the city glowing in fractured patterns far below, yet his thoughts were fixed on the man sitting quietly across from him. Miguel had agreed to stay after hours, his cart parked in the hallway, his mop leaning against the wall like a soldier at rest. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped together, demanding truth. He had seen the notebook. He had heard the warnings. But he needed to know why. Why would a janitor risk himself for secrets that were not his? Why would he notice so much and speak so little? Miguel sighed, his shoulders lifting as though carrying years of silence, and for the first time his eyes revealed more than weariness. "I was not always a janitor," Miguel began, his voice steady but lined with memory. 25 years ago, I was a systems technician at a firm not unlike this one. I built networks. I tested code. I thought I was on my way to something bigger. Then a breach happened. Files stolen. Clients lost. Money vanished. Someone needed to take the blame. I was the easy choice. I did not have connections. I did not have a powerful name. So they said it was my fault. His hands folded tightly in his lap, the scars of betrayal carved into the lines of his face. I tried to fight, but the company destroyed me in the press, and no one would hire me after. My career ended in a week. Ethan sat still, absorbing the weight of the confession. He imagined Miguel years younger, full of hope, stripped of everything by a system that needed a scapegoat. "So you came here," Ethan said softly. Miguel nodded. "I needed work, any work. This building was new then. The job was simple, quiet. No one cared about the janitor, and that suited me. But I never stopped seeing. I knew what it felt like to be ruined by secrets, to lose everything because I trusted the wrong people. So I watched. I took notes. I promised myself that if I ever saw another man walking toward the same trap, I would not stay silent." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, his perception of the man transformed. This was not just a janitor. This was someone forged by loss, sharpened by injustice, who had chosen invisibility as armor, but never blindness. Loyalty was not in grand gestures, Ethan realized, but in the quiet act of protecting what others could not see. Miguel had been defending him long before Ethan understood the danger. His silence, not indifference, but restraint, waiting for the moment when his warnings would matter. For the first time, Ethan leaned back and allowed respect to soften the tightness in his chest. He looked at Miguel not as a custodian of floors, but as a custodian of truth, a man whose scars had made him vigilant, whose loyalty was not bought by salary, but earned by conviction. In the reflection of that loyalty, Ethan saw a mirror of what he hoped to be himself. The plan took shape in the quiet hours of the night, when the building was nearly empty and the city lights stretched across the horizon like a net of stars. Ethan sat at his desk with Miguel beside him, the air charged with a mixture of urgency and resolve. They could not confront Danielle or the CFO directly. Not yet, because confrontation without proof would only drive the betrayal deeper underground. What they needed was a trap, a mirror of the game already being played, something that would turn deception back on itself. Miguel opened his notebook, his handwriting neat and deliberate, and pointed to the patterns of meetings, the times when Danielle appeared without reason, the hours when the CFO lingered after everyone else had left. From those patterns, they built the framework of the snare. Ethan typed a new schedule into the shared system, careful to make it look unintentional. An update entered too quickly, a slip not meant for broad eyes. The schedule hinted at a confidential after-hours review of the encryption algorithm, the very file Danielle and the CFO were desperate to steal. The false entry noted his presence in the building late at night, alone, working on the final draft before government submission. Miguel smiled faintly when he saw the update post, knowing the bait was irresistible. Next came the files themselves. Ethan pulled together dummy documents, strings of code that looked authentic to a casual glance, but carried subtle flaws and hidden trackers. He built them with precision, ensuring they would pass first inspection, yet betray anyone who tried to transmit them. Each file bore the signature of his style, convincing enough that Danielle and the CFO would not question them. He placed them on a secure drive in his office, just visible enough that anyone searching would find them. The final piece was the call. The first call they had tried to use to draw him in before. This time, Ethan would create it himself, dialing into an empty conference line at the exact hour the false schedule promised. Miguel would be nearby, his notebook ready, observing who entered and who lingered, recording every detail. The line would be monitored, and any attempt to intercept or repeat his words would reveal itself. They would be forced to act, believing they had the advantage, while every step was documented. As the plan solidified, Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him, the same clarity he experienced during the hardest negotiations, when every move was calculated like chess. He glanced at Miguel, who watched with quiet approval, and realized he was no longer fighting alone. For the first time, he trusted the perspective of another man who had nothing to gain except justice. They closed the notebook and powered down the screens, the trap within a trap complete. All that remained was to wait for Danielle and the CFO to take the bait, and when they did, their masks would fall. The following afternoon, Danielle appeared at the office carrying a paper bag of pastries and 2 coffees, her smile bright as though she had simply dropped by out of affection. Ethan welcomed her with the calm ease he had practiced, his expression steady, though his mind was sharpened to a blade. He had left the false schedule visible on his desk, not obvious, but close enough that an eye wandering across the papers would find it. Danielle's gaze drifted to the page almost instantly, lingering half a second longer than natural, and then she turned back to him with casual charm. She asked how his work was going, whether he was nervous about the late-night review, her tone light, but her words precise. Ethan felt his pulse tighten, the exact phrase she used matching the false entry. She was supposed to believe it was confidential, yet here she was, revealing knowledge she could not have obtained, except through the channels he and Miguel were testing. He leaned back in his chair, sipping the coffee she brought, nodding as though her comment meant nothing, but inside, he felt the quiet crack of certainty. She laughed softly, telling him not to overthink, reminding him that opportunities like this merger did not wait forever. Her hand brushed across his desk as she spoke, fingers almost touching the secure drive he had planted with dummy files, her eyes flicking toward it before darting away. Ethan kept his expression neutral, but every gesture confirmed what he already feared. Miguel stood nearby, blending into the background with a rag in his hand, wiping the edge of the conference table. To Danielle, he was nothing more than staff, invisible, but Ethan knew his pen was tucked inside his pocket notebook, recording every detail, every word, every slip. Miguel's silence was steady, his posture unchanging, but Ethan caught the slight nod when Danielle pressed too far. She asked if the algorithm was finally complete, whether he had solved the key exchange problem. Ethan had never mentioned that problem to her, not once. Yet she spoke of it confidently, carelessly, proof that she had been reading or hearing things she was not meant to. Ethan's heart ached, even as his mind hardened. He thought of the nights he had trusted her laughter, the mornings she had urged him to eat before work, the way she had seemed to believe in his vision. Now all of it felt rehearsed, every touch a performance, every smile a mask. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but he held his tongue. The trap was working, and silence was the only shield he had left. When she finally left the office, blowing him a kiss and promising dinner later, Ethan closed his eyes and let the quiet sink in. Miguel placed the notebook gently on the desk, its pages filled with the collapse of the fiancée, the proof they needed. Ethan opened his eyes again, steady now, knowing the time for confrontation was drawing close. The mask had slipped, and there would be no turning back. The morning began with an unusual stillness, the kind that pressed against Ethan's chest as he stepped from the elevator into the Crosstech lobby. Sunlight poured through the tall glass walls, turning the marble floor into a pale mirror, but beneath the brightness was a weight that he could not ignore. Miguel was already there, standing near his cart, his mop set aside, his notebook tucked carefully under his arm. The old man gave a brief nod, calm and steady, though his eyes carried the gravity of what was about to unfold. Ethan returned the nod, a silent exchange of trust between two men who had seen enough of deception to recognize its end. The doors opened in a rush, a line of federal agents moving in with swift precision, their dark suits and badges flashing against the polished floor. The air shifted instantly, employees freezing in place as the quiet lobby filled with commands delivered in firm voices. Danielle had just arrived, her heels clicking across the floor, her smile already forming for Ethan. But it faltered when the agents surrounded her. Confusion flickered first, then shock, then fear, though she masked it quickly with outrage, demanding to know what was happening. Ethan said nothing, only watched as an agent read her rights in a clear tone that left no room for escape. Moments later, his CFO entered from the opposite side, carrying a briefcase, his expression confident, as if prepared to lead the day's meetings. He stopped dead at the sight of the agents, his mouth tightening, his grip on the case too firm. An agent stepped forward, snapping it open to reveal documents, false contracts, proof of the merger scheme. His face drained of color as the cuffs closed around his wrists, his smooth, rehearsed answers silenced at last. Employees whispered from the edges of the lobby, eyes wide, phones raised, then quickly lowered, the scene unfolding like a film no one expected to see. Ethan felt the world tilt back into balance, the lies that had hovered like smoke now cleared by the hard air of truth. Danielle glanced at him once more as she was led away, her green eyes filled with fury rather than remorse. But Ethan did not look away. He owed her no words. The CFO avoided his gaze entirely, his betrayal sealed in silence. Miguel stepped closer, handing the agents his notebook, every line of dates and initials preserved with the precision of a man who had lived unseen yet never blind. Ethan also provided recordings, the carefully staged calls, the slips of information Danielle had revealed, the pattern of deception caught in clear detail. The agents nodded, satisfied, their case complete. As the lobby emptied, the echoes of footsteps fading, Ethan stood with Miguel in the center of the marble floor. For the first time in weeks, he breathed without weight, realizing that the simple warning not to take a call had saved not only his company, but his own freedom. He turned to Miguel and said quietly, "I see you now." And he meant it. The weeks that followed felt like the slow return of air after being held too long underwater. Crosstex steadied itself, the news of the arrests rippling through the industry with the force of a storm. Competitors circling, then retreating when they realized the company was stronger than they hoped. Ethan spent long nights in the office, rebuilding trust with his board, explaining strategies, repairing cracks that had spread wider than he first believed. Through it all, one object remained on his desk, not a sleek device or a glowing screen, but a battered notebook, its cover worn soft at the edges, the ink inside still carrying the quiet hand of the man who had written it. Miguel's notebook had been entered into evidence, copied, catalogued, and returned, and when Ethan received it back, he placed it immediately in a frame of dark wood and glass, resting it on the wall above his desk, where clients and staff alike could see. To some it looked odd, a janitor's notebook displayed like a prize, but to Ethan it was more valuable than any award or patent certificate. It was proof that truth does not always arrive dressed in authority or power. Sometimes it hides in the quiet hands of those the world overlooks. Each page was a reminder that Miguel, invisible for years, had seen what others missed, had noticed the patterns, had trusted his instincts when no one else cared. The notebook was not simply a record of betrayal. It was a symbol of survival, of vigilance, of a loyalty forged in silence. Ethan often found himself staring at it between meetings, his eyes drifting upward when voices blurred or numbers swam across the screen. In those moments, he felt the same clarity he had felt the night Miguel confessed his past. When the man admitted He had once been scapegoated, stripped of his career, and yet had chosen to keep watching rather than surrender. That resilience spoke louder to Ethan than the polished speeches of executives. It reminded him that strength was not always loud. Visitors to his office asked about the frame, expecting a story of strategy or innovation. Ethan told them simply that it was the most important piece of security his company had ever possessed. The truth recorded in ink by someone no one thought to ask. He watched their expressions shift as they considered it, realizing perhaps for the first time that empires are not only built by visionaries at the top, but also protected by quiet figures in the background. Miguel still pushed his cart through the halls, though now employees greeted him by name, some stopping to thank him. He accepted it with a modest nod, never seeking attention. Yet Ethan knew the man carried a deeper satisfaction, not from recognition, but from the knowledge that he had kept his promise to himself, that he had finally protected someone from falling into the trap he once knew too well. The notebook in the office was Ethan's daily reminder of that promise fulfilled, and of the truth that saved him. The day Miguel signed his new contract was quiet, without ceremony, but for Ethan, it carried the weight of a turning point. The papers were simple, yet their meaning was not. Miguel was no longer just the janitor who blended into corners. He was now Director of Internal Oversight, a role created to ensure that silence could never again hide betrayal inside Crosstech. Ethan shook his hand firmly, feeling the roughness of skin worn from years of labor, and in that grip was a promise that went beyond titles or paychecks. Miguel did not smile widely, but his eyes carried a steady light, the expression of a man who had finally been seen after too long in the shadows. The announcement spread quickly through the building. Some employees surprised, others curious, but most soon understood. In the weeks since the arrests, the story of Miguel's notebook had moved like a whisper through every floor, a tale of vigilance and quiet courage. People who once hurried past him without a glance now looked at him differently, realizing that the man who mopped the floors had noticed more than all their polished reports combined. Ethan saw the shift in the company's air, the way staff lowered their voices less, the way they greeted one another with more honesty, as if the presence of Miguel in his new role reminded them that every action left a mark. Together they began to rebuild. Ethan tightened systems where trust had been too easily assumed, installing new checks, new balances, but he also listened more, holding forums where junior staff could speak openly, creating channels where concerns traveled directly to his desk. Miguel sat in those rooms, not as a silent custodian but as a guardian, his notebook replaced by digital logs, his observations now part of the company's heartbeat. Ethan watched him ask quiet questions, catching details others skimmed past, and realized how often he himself had missed those same signs. It became clear that Crosstech's strength was not just in algorithms or contracts, but in the people who paid attention. Ethan walked the halls more often, stopping at cubicles, greeting security guards by name, understanding finally that leadership was not measured only by deals closed, but by the trust he nurtured inside his walls. Danielle and the CFO had taught him how fragile trust could be, but Miguel taught him how it could be rebuilt, brick by brick, when honesty was valued above performance. One evening, as the office lights dimmed and the skyline glowed beyond the glass, Ethan stood in front of the framed notebook on his wall. He thought of the moment Miguel whispered his first warning in the lobby, a simple phrase that saved everything he had built. He realized then that wealth was not the number on his accounts, nor the contract signed, but the trust earned from those who chose to stand beside him. Sometimes the janitor saw what the CEO could not, and in that vision lay the future. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you